For he put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. And he put on the garments of vengeance for clothing and was clad with zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds will he repay fury to his adversaries, recompense to his enemies. To the islands he will repay recompense, so shall they fear the name of the Lord. From the west in his glory, from the rising of the sun, when the enemy shall come in like a flood. The Spirit of the Lord shall raise a standard against him, and the Redeemer shall come to Zion. For he put on righteousness.
Good morning. Welcome to Line by Line Bible Studies. Keep forgetting to turn off the looper. So we're going to study the book of Hosea. And Hosea was, let's read the first verse right off the bat, okay? The word of the Lord that came unto Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. Hosea prophesied during the time that the kingdoms were split. See, you may be familiar with the history of Israel and Judah. But you may have heard, if you haven't heard of that, you know of King David. King David, who was, Christ was the son of David. That was one of the requirements of Messiah, that he be a son of David. So, David had a son, Solomon, who you also may have heard of, right? But then, after Solomon came his son, Rehoboam. Rehoboam took bad advice from his young friends who advised him to be, when the people asked that he would kind of ease up on the burdens that Solomon had laid on them for the building of the temple and such, taxes and requirements and things. He basically hardened himself and said, my father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. And in doing so, and ignoring the advice of older and wiser men, he alienated the 10 tribes to the north, meaning all except for Judah and Benjamin, which was the tribes that were in the environment around Jerusalem, and Benjamin also being somewhat of that area. I mean, again, when it says the tribes of Israel, Judah and Benjamin, it does mean it mostly in a geographical sense. Because even down to the time of Christ, you find people of the other 12 tribes among Israel, such as the woman of Asher, someone of the tribe of Zebulun. So it wasn't as though there was a perfect severing along tribal lines. But it was mostly along tribal lines. The northern kingdom was led by the tribe of Ephraim. And the first king of Israel was Jeroboam. Now, the Jeroboam mentioned here in verse 1 is not the same Jeroboam. This is the second king by the name of Jeroboam. And actually, he's not even of the line of Jeroboam, because the northern kingdom of Israel had a checkered history. And meaning there was a lot of overthrows. Not initially. Initially, Jeroboam and his sons ruled. But they were overthrown, I believe, I know that King Ahab, which I believe was of Jeroboam's line. I'm not sure. Again, when I say this is explained, I don't explain it as a historian or as a scholar, but as a Christian teacher. But I will give you as much background as I'm familiar with. Like I said, it's like if I had time, I probably would do a little more research and not just rely on what I know. But it'll be sufficient. So, the king of Israel, Ahab, who was famously married to Jezebel, was overthrown by Jehu, who was one of his generals. And that's like 2 Kings chapter 9, I think. So it's a really interesting chapter. And why not? Why use that when I can just look it up here real quick? Yeah, so Jehu overthrew Ahaz, killing Ahab. Sorry, not Ahaz. Ahaz was the king of Israel. Killing him and his sons, and supplanting the succession, becoming the new king of Israel, and his sons would rule after him for a while, until Jeroboam II, who was the last king of the line of Jehu. And then there was a series of kings and a number of overthrows, the kingdom becoming more and more chaotic until they were conquered by the Assyrians. It was 2 Kings chapter 9. In the 2 Kings chapter 9 is an important reference coming up in this chapter, which we will mention in passing, and maybe even go there and read a bit. I don't know, it's more easily just explained than read through because it's extensive. Okay, and then the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. That's the southern tribe that remained loyal to the house of David when the kingdoms had their split and they had occasional war between each other. In the days of Ahab, they were united. Not united, but allied. That's a better way to say it. And this would overlap somewhat with the prophecy of Isaiah, but Hosea starting earlier, because Jeroboam began before Uzziah, and I believe his reign lasted to just the first few years of Uzziah. So Hosea is considered one of the first of the writing prophets. I believe maybe even the first, if not Amos. I thought Amos was the first. Well, one of the, and canonically, I know in the Hebrew Bible, Hosea comes first. So, but they all began prophesying around the same time, to tell you the truth, with looking with a view towards the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel and the threatened destruction of the kingdom of Judah, which did eventually come less than a century later, but a generation or two it was. So, what else can we say? Oh, Hosea. In the New Testament, when Jesus entered into Jerusalem, they said, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest, save now. And Hosea is a similar word that means salvation, but it's not an uncommon name. And sometimes in the old days, when I first started studying the Bible, I had a teacher who put a lot of emphasis on the meaning of names in their context. And Hosea has names that really are important in their context. Meaning the names have meaning in a meaning that needs to be extracted from them. But that is not true of every name. And I used to read through genealogies and try to get the translations of the names just to try to make sense of the genealogy, as if that would explain the genealogy. As if the names present would reveal some sort of coded message. But or the names of towns and such. But the way people name towns may have nothing. I mean, you could say there are no coincidences, and that's sort of an ultimate truth, that God has a plan for everything. But in the context of the message of God for us in the scriptures, sometimes things are the name is accidental to the message, meaning they don't have a relationship directly. All the Hebrews were named. I mean, if you look at all the prophets, they'll have names that have like some sort of like, oh, well, it's salvation of God, and God is my judge, and the Lord is plenteous. But that's how they name their kids. Yeah, I mean, that's how they name them. So these weren't uncommon names. Like, it's like, wow, the prophet has a really weird name. It means something like this. They were always naming their kids with significant religious names. You know, if later it has some significance because they preach about something, and that is their name is not necessarily a result of the preaching, but rather just a part of their culture. I gave my kids biblical names. My dad gave me a biblical name, and it meant something to him. I don't think I preach the gospel because my name is Paul. You know what I mean? But it just happens to be that I'm named after the apostle because my father was a Christian. Okay. So we will put stock in names as required, but we will not put too much into every name. But names and places have significance. In fact, we're going to talk about another place name here in a minute, so let's go on. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredoms, and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. On the notes that I had, it always just did not specify whether they thought she was indeed a prostitute, as some have said, or whether it just merely indicated she was a daughter of the northern kingdom. And for practical purposes, I don't know if I'm not going to make a definitive statement, because I've seen I looked up, just when I was looking at images to use for my introduction, because I always look for stuff in the public domain so I can use it without worrying about copyright. You know, old woodcuts and stuff like that. That's just simple, and this painting was something to do with Hosea. So the thing about it is, the northern kingdom, one of the first sins they committed was in that when God gave the kingdom to Jeroboam, the original Jeroboam, and all this, you know, let's put all this place in perspective. We're talking the 6th and 7th century. Is that how you count them? Or the 5th and 6th? I forget how you count the centuries back. Is the 1st century BC also like the 1st century AD? Meaning, you know, this is the 21st century, because from 0 to 100 is the 1st century. From 100 to 200 is the 2nd century. So 123 is in the 2nd century, get it? So I think we're talking 5th, 6th century BC. All right, just for general area. You know, the Bible I studied out of has dates different than the ones they talk about now. And so I do not know, since it was printed originally 100 years ago, I assume that the scholars today have better information about specific dates. But specific dates don't mean anything, except unless you have like, well, I know what was going on in Rome in 611 BC, and therefore it's very significant to me to know that the Hebrew rebellion was taking place at the same time as the tanners strike in Syria, and of course in China it was this. You know, I mean, unless you have dates to compare it to, it's just a number. So that's why I generally give the history in terms of a flow of biblical history. Meaning, it's like we're going to talk about in terms of the divided kingdom, between the time of the dividing of the kingdom after the reign of David and Solomon, and the eventual carrying away of captivity. A lot of history has already transpired. We've gone through a number of kings to get to Jeroboam, the second Jeroboam. We've gone through, through the Ahab, the prophet. The king Ahab lived during the days of the prophet Elijah, because Jezebel was, notable in her pursuit of Elijah. So Jehu killed Ahab, and then he had a whole line of kings. It was not a whole bunch, I think there was less than a half dozen. So, and that's just take that with a grain of salt. I used to have, like I said, I used to memorize the names of the kings of Israel and Judah, but I've forgotten that list. Okay. But there was a number of kings after Jehu. Okay, what was the point? Oh, but the northern tribes, the first thing that they had done that had been a big mistake, and in their mind it was important, because the original Jeroboam feared, when God had sent the prophet and taken like these sticks and taken them out of the hand of the king of Judah and given them into the hand of Jeroboam. He gave him the 10 tribes of Israel. And but he was afraid, because all the tribes had the same religion, and he feared that that when his people of the 10 tribes would go down to Jerusalem to worship God and to keep the Passover and to do their traditional things, their hearts would be turned to the king of Judah. And the king of Judah might even use that as an opportunity to turn their hearts to him, and that they might throw off Jeroboam or his successors, right? So what did he do? He set up a golden calf in Samaria and in Dan, and there might have been another location. But he set up the golden calves for them to worship. And he said, "These are your gods which delivered you out of the land of Egypt." I don't know what it is with the Israelites and golden calves, but they seem to set them up all the time. It was probably just because a common way of worshiping. It may have something to do with ancestral things, or the things that the Canaanites practiced in the land before them. But they brought that out of the land of Egypt also. So it was a little bit of paganism they had a tendency towards. And in fact, the northern kingdom was given over almost entirely to idolatry. Not that they did not worship the Lord. Very often it was a combination. They did as the heathen did, because they didn't ignore a God, the Lord. They would just have other gods and the Lord. They'd have the Lord and other gods. So we'll worship Baal. And maybe we worship Baal the most, actually, because he's the most important God. And the Lord we don't forget about the Lord, but, Baal is the one who's helping us right now. All right. So they're given over to the worship of idols and of other gods. Because it's not... Because one of the slams against Catholicism is their making of icons and stuff. And, and according to their doctrine, they do not worship the icons, but they do venerate them, which is kind of a little bit of a weasel word in between. But, it means they have a great deal of respect for them and for the saints they represent. It's not precisely the same, though, obviously. Because it is not the technical idolatry. Though you want to, as a non-Catholic, you feel like you want to convict them on that front, but it's not so precisely, because they don't worship them as gods. But it does go beyond. I think it's not really a useful thing to do. Let's say it may be comforting on some level or whatever. It's like, I'm not going to get into ripping on them for it, but it's not the same. And I wouldn't focus on it, because I think in the modern era we have an idolatry problem, but it's not because it's easy to just look at at Catholicism and lay it at their feet And certainly with Mary, it almost does get into idolatry. It gets close, certainly, and maybe even transgresses into it because they just hold her in such reverence. But even so, it is less concerning to me than the thought of because in Christ, our worship is decentralized, right? We worship the Lord in spirit and in truth, as the Lord Jesus taught the woman at the well in Samaria. And it was interesting. He told her that she was a Samaritan. He saw a Samaritan woman. Samaritans were the people who lived in the northern kingdom, which had been thrown. The kingdom had been thrown out, and the Samaritans were actually foreigners that the Assyrians brought in to populate the land. Because the Assyrians tended to do that. They would deport people from their land and put them in someplace new, and bring in other people from other places and put them in there. And I think this is in part to control people, because if they move you, you are less secure. You're not as familiar with your territory. You're not as resistant. You don't feel as comfortable, in a new land. So it's easier for the Assyrians to maintain control that way. I'm sure that was at least their theory, and it probably worked, at least in the short term, because after a while, the new territory is just as familiar as the old, once you get settled in. So, the idolatry, I think, also of our modern time is also decentralized. And why am I talking about idolatry and not about whoredom? Because whoredom is an analogy for idolatry in the Old Testament, especially here in Hosea, because they have gone after idols. God in this prophet is going to draw a parallel between the children of Israel going after idols and a man's wife going after other men. And that is the kind of whoredom he's talking about. You could say prostitution, or let's say a tendency towards that, or a tendency towards fornication. Remember, in the Old Testament, when let's say a girl was engaged, if she went out and engaged, or if she was just supposed to be a virgin, a young girl, and she went out and had intercourse, they would say she had played the harlot and brought disrespect on her father's house. So playing the harlot, or calling a woman a whore for fornication is a ancient tradition. It is how they have engaged in it, at least as far as that is how it has been regarded for centuries. And in the book of Hosea, it is no different. Obviously, today we don't think of it that way. Yet, that is, and then let me say this, is like, in my personal experience as a Christian, I expect my sons to be as pure as I would expect my daughter to be. But in this context, and it doesn't mention, well, what about the men? Because God is the man in the relationship, and God is absolutely faithful. God has not gone and taken some other people. And in fact, even in the New Testament, he does not cast off Israel, his people who he has chosen, but rather expands the family, so to speak. But the idolatry of the modern age, I think, like our religion, is somewhat decentralized. In the Old Testament, they had the temple, and they had the very obvious presence of God in the Holy of Holies, with the ark present, and the altar of sacrifice, and all the religion was centralized in these rites and in these rituals. But in Christianity, all that has been done away because of Christ. Meaning we don't make sacrifices, we don't do rituals. There are some Christians who still try to observe the feasts and such, and then they'll get into putting tassels on their garments and trying not to wear wool and cotton together. and all that. And as far as I'm concerned, that's all vain because Christ fulfilled it all. And they say oh no, we don't want to pick and choose, but they do pick and choose because they will observe a lot of things, but I don't see them making sacrifices. Say, well, Jesus sacrificed, and that fulfilled those things. And you understand that not one jot or one tittle of the law is supposed to pass away until all is fulfilled. So if Jesus did not fulfill all, then nothing can pass away, no, not even the sacrifices. So he must have fulfilled all, in that the sacrifices are no longer necessary. In that the sacrifices are no longer necessary, then truly nothing in the law is necessary anymore for us for righteousness. It does not mean the things in the law are not true, or they are not profitable for learning. It just means we are no longer bound by all those standards, but we're now bound by the standards of the Spirit. But the Spirit is flexible. And idolatry in the Old Testament was, there are idols and images, and people would bow down and worship them. And they would make sacrifice to them, and they would do abominations with them, which usually means like some sort of sexually impure ritual or such. Or they would eat animals that were forbidden to be eaten under the Old Covenant. They would do all kinds of things they shouldn't do in service to the idols. And very often, like I said, they would do it also having the altar, and then they would make, it started off often with people making altars to God on every high hill and under every green tree. But that worship of God all over the place degenerated because it became a form of idolatry, because they would begin calling on God by other names, and in fact by different personas. In the New Testament, though, when Jesus was speaking to that Samaritan woman, I know we're going a lot in this, but this is we got to lay the groundwork here. He's speaking to that Samaritan woman, and he said to her, the hour is coming, and now is, or did he say that at that point? Whatever. He says, they that worship the Father must worship him in spirit and truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. And the time is coming, and now is, when you will not worship in this mountain, nor yet at Jerusalem, but in spirit and in truth. So the worship of God was decentralized from at Jerusalem to through Christ's sacrifice, being we can worship God wherever we want, something the Israelites could not do. We could worship God wherever we want, but we had to worship him in spirit and truth. Those are the things the Hebrews lacked. They did not have the spirit and truth. They didn't have the Bible, for one. The idea of written copies of the scriptures was nobody had that. In the New Testament, they copied and passed around Paul's letters. And they had the added effect of, by the time of the New Testament, there were copies of the Old Testament that had been distributed around. Because after the captivities to the Assyrians and to the Babylonians, the Jews had started paying more attention to what God had said, and had started copying the prophets and copying the Psalms and trying to maintain their culture and religion in the face of this massive destruction. And so by the time of Jesus, the synagogues had copies of the Bible, or of some of the books, at least to pass around. Our synagogue has the roll of Isaiah, and the one next door has Jeremiah and the Kings, and there's a copy of the Pentateuch in the other town, or whatever. I don't know exactly how that went, where they had they didn't have codices, which we think of as books. They were using rolls. When Jesus reads Isaiah, he reads it off of a roll, which is you double scroll. You roll up one end and unroll the other to get to different parts of it. So he took a wife of the northern kingdom, and she was of the northern kingdom, meaning of idolatry and of whoredom, of fornication, of unfaithfulness. Like the commandments of God were not, she was not going. It's very easy to do this in the modern age also, because I often told God, you can, and I say guys because my friends are men. I don't hang out with women. I have a wife. I don't have girls who are my friends or women who are my pals. I don't pal around with them. That's a recipe for adultery also. What do you think you can't handle it? I'm sure I can handle it, but I just also I tend not to get along with a lot of modern women because I have some very old-fashioned notion and ideas, and they tend to think of me as being a rather horrible person. As wherever I go, there are rumors and negative things said about me, and I think they often suggest I mistreat my wife, which is actually very wrong, as my wife would tell anyone. So I've often told the guys, and women, this is true for you also, you can marry exceedingly bad. You can marry a man of whoredoms too, okay? And they're given over to, not to God, but they may even be Christians, but they're not given over to Christ. They're given over to other things. They are essentially idolatrous in their outlook. You know what I mean? Their hearts are not turned towards the Lord, but they're turned after the affairs of this world. The things like Jesus warned of, the lust of the eyes. I was going to say the lust of the pride of life and all that, but I actually was thinking of the parable of the sower. The fellow among thorns, the deceitfulness of riches, the cares of this life, and also the pleasures of this life. It's like they become a form of worship and idolatry. Because here's the thing. If God must be worshipped in spirit and in truth, and he is the God of truth, right? That means when we have the truth, we're worshiping him. When we're in the spirit, we're worshiping God. That means when we give the same level of activity and attention to other things, it becomes like an act of worship. Especially if we are given over to them to, there's a certain degree to which God has to be at the center of my life. And if other things are occupying the center of my life, they can become a proxy for idolatry for me. I mean, it's not literal idolatry in the Old Testament sense, because there's very little of that. I mean, we have rare people who do worship idols or are into paganism, but that's kind of a fad. As far as like they get into this, I mean, I'm just saying culturally it's not common. Yet we have people whose hearts are estranged from the Lord, the same way a husband or wife can be estranged in their heart from their husband or wife. I mean, they do not have the bond of affection that keeps them faithful to their husband or wife. They do not have the bond of commitment. Affection helps, but it's primarily a commitment. Marriage is a commitment first. It is great to have affection in it. But, I mean, I don't think any amount, you could never, it's hard to love someone enough to be perfectly faithful to them. Yeah, I mean, it takes more than just love and affection. Because love and affection can be like, well, I love them, I don't want to hurt them, but they'll never know about this. You know what I mean? It's not a question merely, you could say, well, if you love them, you'd never do that to them. That's sort of a roundabout towards the idea of commitment. Meaning, I will not do, because of my commitment to them and my love, okay, you can throw love in there if you want, but it's not necessary. But because of my commitment to them, I am committed also to being faithful and to being true. So I'm not going to do this thing. And in that way, stay faithful. They were given over to idols, and into idolatrous practices, and to immorality. So they did not worship God at Jerusalem, nor did they give heed to his commandments. And so, as these things are, because, like the Old Testament, people look at the Old Testament law and they say that's what they did. They followed these things. If a daughter committed fornication, she was stoned. No, it said she should be stoned. That was the law. It does not mean that was how it was practiced. I mean, not many fathers want to see their daughters stoned. And so very often, not just that law, but many laws were not carried out. And so the sins that they were meant to prevent ran rampant. Just like today, like I talk about churches. They're all worried, they're all worried now they're going to be forced to perform homosexual marriages and stuff. And they've given their daughters over to fornication, and their sons. They've given their sons and daughters over to fornication. And they know it. I was sitting in a pastor's house once, and his son and another girl from church are sitting there snuggling on the couch, all physical with each other. This is not and I thought, this is going on under his roof. There's no surprise. And like, oh, well, there's tales of rape and of teenage pregnancy, and it's all going on under your nose. And it's because of here's the thing. A lot of it happens because of the worldly influence. And a lot of it comes through your schools. I'll tell you right now. Schools are where they teach your children to be idolaters. It's because every kid there is, you get 50 kids together, or whatever number, I mean, I grew up in a big schools, so like my class, my elementary school class, there was 3 third grade classes, and they were like 25 kids at least in each one, if not more. And so it was like 75 to 100 kids in my grade level. My high school was like 2,000 kids. Graduating class was over 500. So I went to big schools growing up. But even in smaller schools, you throw a kid into a class with like 30 kids, right? Each one of them has been watching something different on the television, or their parents are into different stuff. Some of them, their parents are using drugs. Some of them, their parents will let them watch R-rated movies. Some of them have, filthy magazines and books laying around. And your kid is just thrown into the slosh with these kids whose parents have taken no care, and whose center is not centered on God, right? And so their kids are not centered. And so their kids become your kids' friends, and their kids will corrupt your children and teach them many things you would rather they not be taught. Not that you don't want to, like I always consider it my duty to talk to my kids about things like sex. I want them to know about sex. I don't want them to be like, that'd be weird. I remember how weird it was. I thought that my parents never talked to me about it. Oh, they talked to me when I was 5 about how evil women were and I should stay away. But that when it mattered, when I was 12 and 13, I remember my dad tried. But I was like, I know all about that, and he didn't want to force the issue, because it's very uncomfortable for people to talk about. I've always been very comfortable talking about it, because you just go ahead and do it. I'm the adult. If you can't be the adult around your kids, you kind of lost control of everything. All right. So he tells him, when I say that about the schools, a lot of you get no options. Well, I've chosen to live my life on the edge of poverty, basically so I can keep my kids out of school. Because I have to work from home, and it's a difficult thing to do, to get work. And it's a lot easier to just go out and get a job. You get a lot more steady pay. You know what I mean? But for me, that was part of the thing when we started having kids. We decided we didn't want to let them be raised, because it's not, I don't mind other kids influencing my kids and them being exposed. I want them to be exposed to things. But the thing is, it's one thing to be exposed. You want your kids to be exposed to danger, to trouble, to difficulty, all those things. Otherwise, they'll be weak. You don't want your kids to not have exposure to difficulty or to challenges or to bad ideas. But what you don't want to do is just give them over to it. You know what I mean? It's the difference between throwing your kid into the deep end of the pool to get them to learn to swim, which might work. It might be okay, and plus you can certainly jump in and help them out if they start to struggle too much, right? If they're not going to make it. But it's another thing to throw them off the ocean line or into the ocean, and because they don't. You leave them in school all day, day after day. I was left in school with, and so what became the center of my world? The school and all the people there, and my position among them, my friendships among them, what was cool, what was, I wanted to, I could either stay a nerd forever or ascend the social hierarchy. And what would I have to do to do that? I listened to the pressure to commit immoral things, to use drugs, to become a son of whoredom, and that was all and all that came from influence, not just from peers, but it was peers at school, peers outside of school. All that stuff was an influence on me and pressured me heavily. And there's nothing my parents would say after so many years of spending most of my time with those people that would, if I was not, certainly my father's influence was heavy, and the fact that I grew up, they were all Christian kids, but the thing is, they were influenced by a culture that was already very ungodly. Back in the 80s, when I was coming of age, I turned 13 in 1986. So 85, I was 12. Yeah, I was in 6th grade in 85. So that's most of my memories are formed starting in the early 80s and stuff. But by comparison today, that was wholesome and innocent, those times. As corrupt as they were, and they were corrupt. Very corrupt. I think I've mentioned this before. Within the first month of being in 1st grade, the little girl I was sitting next to just knew dozens of filthy jokes. Filthy. Explicit filthy. Of things I had never heard of. And if you look at the little girl, you'd never guess she was just loaded with filthy jokes. You know what I mean? It was weird. Weird. So you don't know what you're throwing your child into. You don't know. And you won't. And you can't. Because I don't know who decided when. Did anyone ever just, we just assume it's a good idea. Humans never just said, okay, take all the children and we'll put them all together and put one adult over. One adult in charge of 30 kids. What could go wrong? That's, and we'll make them sit down all day. That'll be great for the boys. Anyways, but somewhere along the line, everyone decided this was a great idea, good thing. And it's because they need to learn, of course, right? And it was much more important that mom go to work so we could have that double income, so we can have that new car every 3 years, and so we could go on vacation a couple times a year. And who cares if our children become children of whoredom? And so, someone raised up in this, unless like in the modern times, unless we realign our lives to the Lord Jesus at some point, unless we wake up and the Lord open our eyes to his truth, and we become Christ-centered people. There's people who are outside of the godly who can be faithful to their wives and husbands, and I know they are. But it's also because of a decision to follow the same idea of fidelity and truth. But once you abandon truth, there's no guarantee of any of that. So she was a woman given over to whoredoms, to idolatry, fornication, you name it. And that's what he married. The Lord said, take a wife of whoredoms. Go ahead, marry unadvisedly. This is what I was saying at the beginning. I warn my guy friends. You can marry very badly. You know? I have a friend who, and he's a Christian apologist, but it's his wife unfaithful. You know? And I don't know about how that started and all that, but, obviously when someone's unfaithful, there's something else at the center. Or it can be more than that. I mean, at some level, it's like, no, we're not truly centered on Christ. We may want to center ourselves in Christ if we're unfaithful. We may want to, but in some level we haven't. Because if Christ was at the center, that would be what was reigning in our life. Take you a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. And it's whoredom in the sense of idolatry, adultery. Idolatry is adultery in the eyes of God, meaning in that Israel he had taken to wife. Well, we're going to I guess I feel like I got to explain it all the way from the beginning. Because when I was young, I think if I encountered this, I wouldn't understand it at all. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. It says, take a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, meaning you're going to have a wife of whoredoms, so your children will be born of this whorish wife. So he took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim. And I forgot what Diblaim means. Something plural. I am is the plural. Like Egypt is Mitzrayim with the im at the end. Sorry about the overpronunciating there. But meaning double defense. I think actually Diblaim maybe means something like about figs. Anyways, she conceived and bare him a son. And the Lord said unto him, call his name Jezreel, or Jezreel, for yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu. It will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. And it shall come to pass at that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Now, Jezreel is important. The place name, what does the name mean? Oh boy, I forget what it meant. Oh, it means two things. It means, it has a dual meaning. El at the end is a suffix that means God. It means God will scatter, but it also means God will sow, because scattering and sowing is the same thing. So it just depends on context. What does it mean if he's going to scatter, like in terms of destruction, or sow in terms of planting? So it has a dual meaning, and that will come into play. But the primary meaning is not embedded in the meaning of the word Jezreel, but rather in the place Jezreel. Jezreel was the place where Jehu betrayed Ahab and killed him. Jezreel was the place where he slew Jezebel. And not only that, but he also killed the king of Judah, which was not what God had called. He was to, yes, punish Ahab, but Jehu carried the blood too far. He went too far and didn't only carry out the Lord's purpose in destroying Ahab, he also slew the king of Judah. He also, and he did the things he did. I've heard it suggested what his purposes weren't pure or whatever. And maybe so. He wasn't so much fulfilling God. He was very eager to fulfill God's word. And that it benefited him. You know what I mean? It's one thing to sort of... It's like... in the book of Revelation, it talks about the two witnesses. They will smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will. Fire will proceed out of their mouths and devour their enemies. You know. And this can be done in various ways. Meaning, the prophet can be, or the one who executes God's judgment, can be an instrument of, it's like when God said to David, "You're a bloody man and you will not build my temple." David had done a lot of things. Though God's love did not depart from him, he had done many things which defiled him ultimately. He was too much blood on his hands. I mean, he had the blood of Uriah the Hittite, whose wife he had taken. That was just too much. Too much bloodshed. Too many things that were done on the edge of God's mercy. You know, where God's mercy did not depart, but God was not pleased. I do not imagine the two witnesses sort of eagerly burning people with fire, taking delight in plaguing people. You know, like some sort of cartoon villain. Because the thing is, the enemies of God's people have been like the cartoon villains to destroy and to punish God's people, like in the Old Testament, the Assyrian. You know, did not the Lord send me to destroy you and to make everyone drink their own piss? As it says, that's not exactly what it says, but the word is exactly there. You know, they're going to eat their own dung and drink their own piss. You know? And the degree to which the enemy says that with relish. I can't wait to make you do that. Can't wait to grind your face into your punishment. And there are prophecies like in Isaiah that I can think of, where he says, you know, after I use them, I will turn on them and judge them. Because in so bringing about God's judgment, their hearts are not right. You know, vengeance is mine, vengeance belongs to me, saith the Lord, but he is not greedy of vengeance. He does not delight in punishing the wicked. Men often do take perverse pleasure in doing evil things. And sometimes the reason they take perverse pleasure because they justify themselves. They say, well, they have it coming. So I take a great deal of pleasure in bringing pain to them because they deserve their punishment. But the Lord says he takes no pleasure in the punishment of the wicked, but that his pleasure would be that they would turn from their wicked ways. And so also, when the servant of God, when you're in serving God, if we were called to bring about God's justice, or like the two witnesses to bring about plagues, we should not do it with a gleeful smile on our lips, but with grim determination and, you know, and what would I call it? Resigned to the fact that this is absolutely necessary. There is a place for punishment. There is a place for vengeance. There is a place and a time for God to pour out his plagues. But it is not a cause of rejoicing or of a gleeful participation. Because if we participate gleefully in destruction and death, we're not the children of God. You know, when the disciples asked, you know, they said, hey, you know, these towns did not receive you? Shall we call down fire from heaven as Elijah did? Jesus said to them, you don't know what spirit you're of. And it's not that there's no time ever to bring down fire from heaven. But I think what it was is they were just a little too excited at the prospect of burning a whole city down. It's like when the prophet Jonah was sent to Nineveh. And he was actually one of the first prophets, I believe, because he came long before. His prophesying to Nineveh was in preparation that Nineveh would eventually... I forgot what the days he prophesied in. I'd have to go look that up. But I know he was one of the early prophets, that's for sure, because the Assyrians were not a factor much longer after they conquered the kingdoms. Within 60 years or so, the Babylonians were on the rise, and the Assyrians were on the decline as far as an empire. So in Jezreel, Jehu had executed God's vengeance, but with a little bit too much of his own. It was not for the sake of justice or truth, though that was mingled. It's easy to just wrap yourself in it, because you'll read, and you can read 2 Kings chapter 9, and you can read about Jehu and his destruction of Ahab. Did not the Lord send me to do this? The Assyrian had the same words in his mouth as he spoke to the people on the walls of Jerusalem in Isaiah chapter 36, was it? Or 35 or whatever, in there in the 30s. He had the same idea that did not God send me against you? Did not the Lord? How is there peace when the Lord, you have spilled the blood of the prophets, and you can wrap yourself in all this righteousness and justify them and their killing, but the Lord looks on our hearts, and so it is a touchy business being the instrument of God's vengeance, because it is difficult to do that and still maintain your own integrity and not become corrupted by the violence and bloodshed. You know what I mean? The violence and bloodshed corrupts as much as sex or anything else, any other pleasure. People begin to take pleasure in murder and mayhem and bring about destruction. It's like that scene from that movie. I haven't seen it in years, but I always remember as a teenager seeing, was it Apocalypse Now or whatever, the one where they're playing the Ride of the Valkyries. And they're in Vietnam. And this is a movie, so this is not necessarily true, but the vision is true of like the pleasure taken. They're like flying around and they're just shooting at people in the jungle or in the rice paddies. They're just machine gunning them. And then it's not clear whether they're enemies or not. You know what I mean? But even if they are, they're in the process of like gathering food and stuff. And these guys are just having a lot of fun shooting people. And as a friend of mine, or an acquaintance of mine, someone who's close to me, a friend of someone who was close to me told him of his experience in the Gulf War, that it was a lot of fun to shoot those Arabs. As far as I've gone out with my kids and we've played war games, and shooting at people is fun, isn't it? It's a game. But when you start engaging in the real thing, and the fun aspect can overtake your sense of the gravity of what you're actually doing. And it's a natural human response, because it's hard to maintain like a balance of like between either becoming completely broken in your experience, meaning literally like bringing about death and mayhem can damage you mentally, whereas you can have this horrible, like a friend, also I remember when we were kids, as kids will often do, they say torturing animals is sort of a sign of psychopathic tendencies or whatever, but we were quite young and we were catching tadpoles with a net and we were throwing them on rocks and smashing them, right? He was about 2 years older than me, so I was probably like 6 or 7, so I had very little consciousness of this. This is not something I went. We did this once, and it's because it started with the giggling and the laughing and the smacking, and it was fireworks of guts. Apparently, it affected his conscience greatly, and he dreamt of tadpoles returning for vengeance, which is kind of a funny. I never bothered me, and I never did it again, right? It's not something I had a tendency to continue in doing, but that conscience for the killing, and it was just little animals, amphibians who have no heart at all. Amphibian would eat you without thinking for a moment if it could. It would absolutely devour you and not even care how much you suffered. Not in the least. It's an amphibian. I mean, they don't care. But he had compassion for it. Well, God has compassion for all the creatures also, in their appropriate level. I mean, God is high and the creatures are low. But in that he is so high, he has a great compassion. Meaning, relative to his position, his compassion is great, considering he could barely notice us and it wouldn't matter. Right? It wouldn't matter at all. But God is promising here to avenge the blood of Jezreel, which was Jehu, in taking the kingdom as God had promised it to him, had gone overboard in his lust for blood. Though he carried out God's will, they were to be killed. But Jeroboam was the last king of Jehu's line. Or no, last but one. There would be one more. I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. And she conceived again and bare a daughter. Okay, we're going to have to talk about that next time. So we will try not to recap too much the daughter of whoredoms part. Sometimes I feel like I'm just never capturing it quite the way I want to. But when we're given over to other things and not wholly to the Lord, when the Lord is in the center, we become at least in tendency towards that. We are leaning into idolatry. We are leaning into having other things, because the idol is the center of the town, or the center of your home. They would put their idols. Just like Jerusalem was the center of the Israelite world. And God was there at the center. And God belongs at the center of our lives. If we are not centered on God, if we are centered on other things, other than the true God, the God of truth. Because there are other gods. Remember, there were gods and goddesses that, they were like, well, let's make fertility the center of everything. So we'll worship fertility and, sexuality and all that stuff. Or we'll worship battle and power and strength. So we'll have a God of strength and power at the center of everything. A God of battle and of bloodshed. Or a goddess of fertility and sex. These things is what they would. You ever seen the idol? I forgot what they call it. There's some ancient idol. It's like some big pregnant woman with breasts naked and such. These are the idols they worshipped. Or they worshipped upright penis, phallic, symbols of the erect penis they worshipped. Because they're like, that's the center of everything. Now that's where it is. That's where the center of everything lies, in the erect penis, because that's where we have children, and that's the center of life. That's what they, and you know what? Today, people are living their lives just as though at the center of their life there was just an erect penis. That was the center of their life. That's a great note. Study. It's funny. All right. Thanks for joining me in this study. We will pick up again tomorrow in verse 6. I'm going to turn off that. Where is the... There we go. Here we go. On our way... Oh, and I lost my music. Here we go.
For he put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. And he put on the garments of vengeance for clothing and was clad with zeal as a cloak. According to their deeds will he repay fury to his adversaries, recompense to his enemies. To the islands he will repay recompense, so shall they fear the name of the Lord. From the west in his glory, from the rising of the sun, when the enemy shall come in like a flood. The Spirit of the Lord shall raise a standard against him, and the Redeemer shall come.